Authorities believed they'd caught another driver violating regulations. But when a damaged logbook exposed a badge, seasoned officials stood frozen. What hidden truth did this reserved woman carry in the dust of an aging checkpoint? Above Interstate 40, the moon sat low, throwing silver patterns across the pavement, while Lisa Hartwell, age 39, steered her forest green Kenworth through the peaceful section approaching Albuquerque. The engine's steady drone provided comfort, a cadence that had accompanied her through endless journeys. Yet this evening carried an unusual quality. The atmosphere felt weighted, as though the wilderness itself paused in anticipation that a blinking neon marker indicated the checkpoint approaching. Lisa decelerated, guiding the vehicle into the inspection area while the vacant highway vanished in her wake. Stones ground beneath her wheels as she halted adjacent to a weathered orange marker. Two officials stood waiting beneath fluorescent illumination. Sergeant Bill Brown, approximately 50 years old with a prominent mustache and gaze hardened through decades of administrative work, and Officer Dean Franklin, younger with a pristine uniform and anxious expression. Brown propped himself against the scale building's exterior, examining Lisa's vehicle with an expression approaching disdain. Franklin fidgeted nervously, gripping his writing board. Lisa lowered her window, allowing the nocturnal breeze to wash across her features. "Good evening, officers," she spoke calmly, her voice unwavering. "Exit the vehicle, ma'am," Brown commanded, his delivery monotone yet laced with irritation. Lisa complied, her footwear touching down gently on the fractured pavement. She maintained an upright posture, shoulders back, her composed demeanor only intensifying Brown's annoyance. Their examination began with an aggressive meticulousness that contradicted the station's emptiness. Franklin wavered as Brown shouted directives, though anxiety regarding his commanding officer maintained his obedience. They ransacked Lisa's cabin, forcing open storage areas, unzipping her weathered travel bag, casting her carefully organized clothing and belongings into the grid. Next came the logbook. Brown opened it with exaggerated revulsion, ripping pages loose and allowing them to scatter groundward. "Examine this. Are you attempting to conceal something?" he mocked. Lisa stayed quiet, her expression set, vision locked on the swirling particles catching illumination from the lights overhead. Heavy silence descended upon the checkpoint. Franklin's grip shook faintly as he accessed another storage space. He stole a glance at Lisa, detecting the trace of something traumatic in her gaze. Recollections surfaced behind her impassive face. Military transports navigating through darkened ravines, automatic fire splitting the darkness, IED blasts shaking reinforced trucks. Her fingers tightened around her bag's handle as the phantoms of former terrors murmured at her consciousness's periphery. Franklin cleared his throat with difficulty. "Sergeant, perhaps we ought to—" Brown directed a stare toward him sufficiently cutting to pierce metal. "We have quotas, Franklin. Should we fail to document adequate infractions this period, management descends upon us. Don't become sympathetic." He propelled a severed page from Lisa's documentation across the area, the paper gliding over stones like an injured creature. Lisa's attention wandered to the shadowy expanse beyond the checkpoint's brightness. The interstate extended outward like an infinite lifeline, offering escape, obscurity, liberation. Yet here she remained, vulnerable beneath the severe glare of individuals who perceived her as data, not human. Within the scale building, the communication device crackled with exchanges from adjacent facilities. Another official's voice grumbled regarding extended hours and the pressure to satisfy quotas. Franklin's complexion paled. This contradicted his expectations of the position. He'd enlisted hoping to maintain highway security, not to intimidate solitary motorists after midnight. Lisa's vision connected with Franklin's for a brief instant. In that wordless interaction, he perceived it. The burden she transported, the unvoiced turbulence behind her composure. However, before articulation was possible, Brown slammed the travel bag closed, his exasperation overflowing. "Explain why your documentation appears so pristine," he demanded, advancing sufficiently near that Lisa detected stale coffee on his exhalation. She remained unflinching. Her consciousness existed elsewhere, returned to military transports winding through overseas deserts, where quietness preserved her existence and inquiries could result in casualties. The moment stretched endward, the facility eerily soundless aside from the remote wailing of wild dogs. Lisa inhaled slowly and profoundly, grounding herself, declining to provide the officials the gratification of witnessing terror or fury at a subtle secondary narrative simmered. Franklin's moral compass struggled against his directives. He recorded observations on his board, yet hesitated to document infractions. Through the radio, dispatch announced a suspicious automobile detected miles along the highway, a notification that genuine threats still traversed the routes while they squandered time harassing a woman whose sole transgression was flawless documentation. The examination persisted with nearly frantic intensity. Brown wrenched open lateral storage areas, digits marked with particles and lubricant, grumbling beneath his breath regarding arrogant motorists. Lisa's bag remained torn open beside her footwear, documents fluttering in the tepid desert current. Abruptly, Franklin raised his head, voice subdued and hesitant. "Sergeant, I believe we've exceeded appropriate boundaries here." Brown's head rotated sharply, wrath in his vision. However, before response was possible, a wind surge traversed the area, elevating one final folded page from Lisa's documentation and propelling it skittering beneath her vehicle's rear axle. Lisa's gaze pursued the drifting paper, the instant extending lengthy and slender like a silhouette at dusk. The evening felt animated with pressure, the checkpoint's vibrating illumination projecting severe outlines across the damaged terrain. Brown advanced, reducing his voice to a hiss. "You don't make determinations, youngster. Should you desire a career in this organization, you'd better comprehend where your allegiances belong." Lisa sealed her eyes for a pulse, compelling herself toward the immediate moment. Reality carried the scent of diesel and heated dust, the sounds of highway quietness compressing inward. The bag's fastener rattled softly in the breeze, resembling the final tone of an expiring melody. Somewhere profound within, the resilience that formerly transported her through explosive zones and midnight military transports began illuminating once more. Lisa understood this constituted merely another combat zone, one absent projectiles, yet abundant with hazards nonetheless. As the officials reorganized for another examination of her vehicle, Lisa straightened, her voice subdued yet unbreakable. Have you concluded yet? Brown's vision constricted. However, momentarily, Franklin observed her not as a suspect, but as someone who'd confronted tempests he couldn't begin comprehending. And in that delicate quietness, the wilderness held its exhalation that Brown's forbearance diminished with each passing instant. He tore through Lisa's lateral storage spaces, casting roadside implements and aged receipts into the earth. Franklin lingered at the illumination's boundary, gnawing his lower lip, his expanding unease as evident as the perspiration glistening on his brow. The pressure twisted more firmly, extending over the checkpoint like a tempest approaching rupture. Lisa remained motionless as rock, vision pursuing every action without vocalization. Her quietness only amplified Brown's wrath. "Do you believe you possess superior intelligence to us, lady?" he erupted, wrenching open a zippered section beneath the sleeping area in her cabin. His grip vanished internally, then resurfaced, grasping a compact, weathered leather container. He tore it apart with a motion of his arm. Something weighty and metallic escaped, plummeting through atmosphere. It contacted with a muted sound in the swirling particles at Lisa's footwear. A Weather Department of Defense transport contractor identification. Its carved eagle capturing the severe radiance of the lights overhead. The evening transformed silent, preserved for the remote lament of a wilderness wind. Duration appeared to halt. Brown stared vacantly, incapable of processing what he'd grasped moments previously. However, Franklin advanced, vision enlarged. He descended to one knee, removing particles from the identification with shaking digits. Understanding emerged. His elder sibling had shared accounts of civilian motorists in Afghanistan who confronted assaults to transport provisions. This identification wasn't a keepsake. It was acquired through ordeal. Lisa's respiration intensified, recollections colliding into her consciousness. A transport advancing through Afghan territory beneath black atmospheres. Tracer ammunition stitching the space above reinforced vehicles. Communication devices crackling with critical requests for medical personnel. The nauseating impact of detonations along the roadway. She recalled evenings without celestial bodies where headlights penetrated through obscurity dense with combustion and terror. Franklin gazed upward, voice barely audible. "Sergeant, do you comprehend what this represents?" However, Brown retreated, complexion reddened, vision darting to the identification as though it might incinerate him. Momentarily, he no longer maintained dominance, his power disintegrating like particles in his grasp. Within the scale building, the communication device emitted with subdued, critical nature. Additional officials, detecting fragments of Franklin's address to his commanding officer, commenced murmuring. The information propagated like combustion. A female motorist possessing a transport identification, a phantom from conflicts most had disregarded. The checkpoint, formerly a location of intimidation, felt abruptly exposed, vulnerable to verities that couldn't be reversed. Lisa's expression remained inscrutable. She descended, retrieved the identification with rehearsed tenderness, and secured it in her grasp. Her voice emerged subdued, resolute, transporting the burden of innumerable unspoken distances. "This examination has concluded." Brown separated his mouth to counter, yet faltered as Franklin's vision secured on his, confronting him with subdued defiance. A transformation descended over the area. The authority arrangement no longer remained his to direct. In the darkness, Franklin contacted his commanding officer with trembling grip. "Sir, we require direction," he muttered, voice substantial with sentiment. "I believe we've transgressed a boundary." Meanwhile, Lisa's consciousness rotated with irregular portions of former transports. The evening they transported injured military personnel through a destruction area, the occasion she rested beneath her vehicle's covering in a dried waterway to evade mortar bombardment, the visages of companions who never returned. Each recollection clawed at her composure, yet she maintained uprightness, declining to display the fracture in her protection. Beyond the checkpoint illumination's perimeter, vehicles rumbled past on the interstate, their headlights resembling gradual moving celestial bodies. Through the communication device, abbreviated voices requested verification. Was the identification authentic? Who constituted this woman? Franklin retreated beside Lisa, voice steady despite his anxiety. "Ma'am, I apologize," he expressed gently, vision lowered. "I lacked awareness." Brown's fist compressed at his flanks. He glanced at Franklin, then at Lisa, the reality he dominated mere moments previously now escaping beyond his control. His vision burned with exasperation, yet terror flickered there additionally. The identification had accomplished what verbal communication never could. In one compact, dusty instant, it eliminated every presumption, every inexpensive insult, every minor misuse of authority. Throughout the checkpoint, murmurs and communication exchanges intensified. Motorists in sequence lowered their windows, observing with subdued inquisitiveness. The narrative of Lisa Hartwell was already forming. Account transmitted on CB frequencies and late evening dining establishment discussions. Lisa permitted herself a solitary gradual exhalation. She encountered Franklin's attention and perceived regard and humiliation in his vision. Transmissions crackled across CB communication devices as information of Lisa Hartwell's identification propagated like combustion through the wilderness evening. From adjacent checkpoints to vehicle stops numerous distances away, discussion illuminated the frequencies. A female motorist, call designation Night Sparrow, had been detained, and her former transport identification had materialized. Murmurs of her designation danced across channels, transported by motorists who recalled accounts of a civilian who'd operated reinforced vehicles through Inferno to deliver provisions to military personnel in necessity. Returning to the checkpoint, Sergeant Brown maintained rigidity, vision secured on the identification still grasped in Lisa's grip. Franklin had withdrawn, communication device compressed to his auditory organ as he conversed quietly with his commanding officer. The administrator, Lieutenant Simmons, was traveling, his automobile's headlights penetrating through the obscurity as he accelerated along the interstate. Lisa reclined against her Kenworth's protective panel, perceiving the vibration of the propulsion system beneath her grasp. Each oscillation reminded her of her continued presence, continued respiration, yet her consciousness reeled with illuminations of history. The reinforced transport stalled on a mountain route, communication devices animated with critical requests. The evening she maintained compression on a military member's injury as projectiles contacted metal. The dawn when she observed a medical evacuation aircraft vanish into the sunrise, transporting companions she'd never encounter again in abrupt roar. of propulsion systems disrupted her contemplations. Two elder motorists, vehicles idling behind hers, descended from their cabins. One, a facial-haired individual with exhausted vision, examined Lisa's identification, then her features. Night Sparrow. He spoke hoarsely. Lisa wavered, then acknowledged once. His vision softened. Remarkable. Believed you constituted merely mythology. He expressed quietly, his voice substantial with something resembling reverence. Franklin terminated his communication exchange, glancing anxiously between Lisa and Brown. His commanding officer had validated the identification's legitimacy, and Simmons remained minutes distant. Brown's expression twisted, a tempest of wrath and disbelief developing as his power escaped from his control with each passing instant. He hissed at Franklin, "Do you believe you're a champion now? Destroying your profession over some deteriorated motorist." However, Franklin maintained firmness, his voice more stable than his sensation. "She's not merely some motorist. She constitutes more of a champion than either of us will ever become." Throughout them, pressure expanded like a storm formation. A collection of motorists assembled near the checkpoint entrance, information propagating among them that Lisa Hartwell had preserved transport secured under bombardment overseas. Some had encountered the narratives years previously on isolated interstates. Accounts of a woman who operated through assault areas without wavering, acquiring the designation Phantom Motorist. Now positioned in the dim checkpoint illumination, they comprehended the narrative was authentic. Lisa's attention swept over the compact assemblage, her consciousness divided between relief and apprehension. She'd invested years attempting to dissolve into the infinite distances of interstate, concealing the suffering of injuries that never completely recovered and the recollections that clawed at her in subdued instants. The markings on her physical form were insignificant compared to those in her consciousness. Evenings awakening to phantom detonations, days invested gripping the control mechanism until her knuckles transformed pale merely to maintain history at distance. However, this evening, the phantoms of former transports wouldn't remain concealed. She perceived them ascending, transmissions of the deceased transported on the wilderness wind. A portion of her desired to escape, to ascend in her cabin and vanish into the expanse where nobody understood her designation. Yet another portion of her, profound and determined, combusted with subdued satisfaction that declined to conceal any more. Lieutenant Simmons's patrol automobile arrived, crimson and azure illumination painting the checkpoint in transforming darkness. He departed, his expression inscrutable as he absorbed the dispersed documentation pages, the tense officials, and the cluster of wordless motorists. Franklin advanced, voice subdued yet unwavering as he clarified everything. Simmons rotated to Lisa, vision settling on the identification in her grip. He inclined his cranium faintly, a motion of regard more articulate than verbal communication. Then he secured Brown with a stare that penetrated more profoundly than any vocalization. "Sergeant, you've committed a substantial error this evening," Simmons expressed quietly, his voice composed yet lethal, that Brown's complexion drained of pigmentation. Meanwhile, Franklin transformed beneath the burden of what he'd accomplished, divided between the terror of Brown's wrath and the certainty that he couldn't maintain position while someone like Lisa was processed like a transgressor. Throughout him, motorists murmured gently, expressions of appreciation and former recollections threading through the collection like a tepid current. Lisa absorbed an exhalation, the nocturnal atmosphere severe in her respiratory organs. She observed Franklin, perceived the uncertainty still residing in his vision. "You executed the appropriate action," she expressed gently, her voice transporting the unbreakable resilience of someone who'd survived considerably worse than a midnight examination transformed incorrect. Yet an inquiry loomed substantial in her consciousness. Should she ultimately vocalize her account audibly, or permit the narrative of the phantom motorist to remain a murmur on the interstates? Dawn advanced over the wilderness, painting the atmosphere in subdued rose shades and glistening golds. The severe illumination of the checkpoint diminished beneath the gentle radiance of daybreak, darkness retreating into the vacant interstate beyond. Lisa Hartwell positioned by her vehicle, the evening's tribulation carved into every contour of her features, yet her attention steady, transparent, uncompromised. Lieutenant Simmons navigated through the checkpoint with subdued power, evaluating the torn documentation pages, the scuffed bag, the destruction of an examination that had rotated beyond. Dominance. He absorbed Franklin's statement, the younger official's voice resolute yet colored with remorse. He examined the identification, its diminished metal capturing the sunrise, a compact artifact of bravery that communicated an account more potent than any vocalized expression. Ultimately, Simmons rotated to Lisa, his vision encountering hers without wavering. "Ms. Hartwell," he commenced, voice subdued, transporting a significance that penetrated through the silence of the assembled motorists. "Representing the organization, I extend apologies for what you sustained this evening. Your contribution deserves regard. We disappointed you." Lisa transformed, the expressions contacting more substantially than she anticipated. She'd prepared for wrath, additional accusations, another confrontation. Instead, she discovered something considerably rarer. Comprehension, a subdued murmur traversed through the compact assemblage of motorists, weathered individuals who'd halted to observe, their features lined by years on the route. Some observed Lisa with enlarged vision. Others acknowledged gradually, as if recognizing something they consistently suspected yet never ventured to accept. Simmons retreated, addressing the checkpoint personnel. "All citations against Ms. Hartwell are nullified, effective instantly. Sergeant Brown, you're dismissed from responsibility pending examination." Brown's expression collapsed, disbelief solidifying into wordless wrath as he comprehended he'd forfeited everything in a solitary, unforgiving evening. Franklin maintained greater uprightness, his terror replaced by something resembling subdued satisfaction. He captured Lisa's vision, hesitant yet determined. "I'm submitting for relocation," he informed her, voice husky. "Driver Security and Welfare Organization. I desire to guarantee what transpired this evening doesn't transpire again." Lisa maintained his attention, and a compact, exhausted smile emerged across her features. "That's beneficial," she expressed gently. "We require individuals like you beyond the checkpoint." CB communication devices illuminated as motorists distributed what they'd observed. Accounts of night sparrow propagated from dining establishment compartments to freight locations. Narratives expanded. Some claimed she'd formerly operated her vehicle through a combat engagement to access an isolated military unit. Others declared she'd extracted injured military personnel from combusting automobiles. Particulars obscured, yet one verity combusted more intensely than the sunrise. Lisa Hartwell had endangered everything overseas, then returned merely to confront suspicion and disregard. Yet even confronting compact, minor authority, she never fractured. The destroyed remains of her documentation remained dispersed across the area, pages marked with particles and wheel impressions. A weathered motorist descended to retrieve one, folding it meticulously as though it constituted a sacred artifact. "She's a narrative," he muttered to the individual beside him. "They'll be communicating her account extensively after our departure." Lisa rotated toward her Kenworth, its verdant coloring capturing the daybreak illumination like precious stone protection. She ascended into the cabin, each movement gradual yet certain. The weathered seat embraced her like a former companion as she positioned behind the control mechanism. Her identification, polished by years of subdued grips, descended into a new concealed storage space beneath the instrument panel, a location secure from careless vision yet consistently proximate to her essence. She absorbed an instant, observing the solar body ascending over the infinite ribbon of interstate extending eastward. Recollections of transports, of visages forfeited and evenings survived, drifted through her consciousness like phantoms dissolving into the dawn. However, for the initial occasion in years, those recollections positioned without severe boundaries, the injuries of history ultimately softening beneath the illumination of comprehension that in the mirrors, Lisa captured glimpses of motorists ascending returned into their vehicles. Some elevated grips in wordless salutation. Others provided brief, respectful acknowledgments. The novice, Franklin, positioned near the checkpoint entrance, observing her with vision that promised transformation. Lieutenant Simmons conversed quietly into his communication device, distributing directives to adjacent checkpoints. Examinations were to remain equitable, motorists processed with regard, particularly those who transported accounts in their quietness. Lisa's grip rested on the transmission control, the propulsion system rumbling to animation beneath her. The oscillation pacified her. A recognizable pulse she trusted beyond any verbal communication. She released an extended exhalation, the evening's disorder dissolving into the tepid atmosphere. As the Kenworth advanced forward, Lisa directed it smoothly returned onto the interstate. The atmosphere illuminated, and with each distance, the wilderness appeared to expand. No longer a location of suspicion, but a route forward. Her account would persist on the frequencies, a subdued narrative traversing from vehicle halt to vehicle halt, reminding others that champions don't consistently wear uniforms or demand recognition. Sometimes they wear diminished denim, transport former markings, and operate solitary through the evening, their bravery concealed in the cadence of the accessible route. And consequently, with the expanse combusting ahead, Lisa Hartwell compressed forward, her history an immediate moment, ultimately a tranquility, determined to maintain motion, not merely for herself, but for every motorist who required a notification that resilience arrives in numerous configurations. This account reminds us that champions don't consistently wear uniforms. Sometimes they wear diminished denim and operate solitary through the evening. What would constitute your action if you discovered the subdued individual beside you possessed an account like leases. Provide commentary below. And if this affected you, don't disregard to appreciate, distribute, and register to embrace the journey for additional potent accounts on the accessible route.